We've seen villains in the MCU pull off some pretty incredible feats working on their own, but imagine how much havoc could be caused if villains could just get past their differences and team up together. A group of villains teaming up together would be downright evil, dangerous, or even sinister. If you've seen Spider-Man Far From Home, the post-credit scenes didn't exactly confirm the rumors of the notorious Sinister Six showing up in the MCU, but they definitely laid the groundwork to have them appear in the future. We'll talk about who these characters are and why they almost certainly spell disaster for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and specifically for Spider-Man. Spider-Man has been one of the most popular superheroes of all time since he first swung onto the pages of Marvel Comics in 1962. Not only has he been protecting New York City from the forces of evil for decades, but the 2002 Spider-Man movie helped in no small part to kick off the superhero movie craze. For years, Sony owned the rights to Spider-Man and all associated characters, which meant fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe despaired at the thought of him never joining the rest of the Avengers. Seriously, there was a while there where we were just J. Jonah Jameson levels of desperate to catch a glimpse of Spider-Man. But of course, as we all know, we finally got to see our favorite hero in Captain America Civil War. And almost immediately we began harping on and on about getting to see a particular group of villains. Not only are the Sinister Six an essential part of Spider-Man's rogue gallery, but we had been teased about seeing them on the big screen for so long without any kind of payoff. Sure enough though, Marvel Studios kind of teased us yet again during an extra scene in Spider-Man Far From Home. And this time, we don't think that they're going to leave us hanging like Sony did. In the mid-credits scene, we were all expecting to see a dejected Mysterio joined by some other characters like the Vulture, the Scorpion, and the Shocker, all of which you'll probably recognize from the previous movie, Spider-Man Homecoming. But there's also the Chameleon, who we haven't actually seen yet, despite the fact that he's one of Spidey's oldest adversaries in the comics. In actuality, we got to see Spider-Man outed to the public from J. Jameson himself, setting up a future where both Peter Parker and Spider-Man may be a huge target for multiple villains. We'd say just about 6 to be exact. And this cliffhanger scene here is a nod to Aunt May's discovery in Homecoming and Tony Stark declaring himself as Iron Man way back in 2008. The huge target on Peter's back may also mean the return of the notorious Norman Osborn. Even if you've never turned the pages of a comic book, we feel confident you know who Norman Osborn is. He's been on the big screen before, and we all know that Green Goblin is one of Spider-Man's greatest foes. Not only is he powerful as an individual, but if Oscorp is in the MCU, then all the Earthbound characters you care about are in serious trouble. And it only makes sense that Stark Tower could now be replaced by Oscorp, setting up a natural transition into the MCU for one of Spider-Man's biggest foes. Of course, we were all saddened by the demise of Tony Stark during Avengers Endgame, but let's be practical here. The loss of Tony not only means that we're down a superhero, but also means there is a serious void of power, and we can only imagine some of the people rushing to fill it don't have the best of intentions. After all, just think of all the times that Tony's massive wealth and resources came in handy. Now imagine someone like Norman Osborn with the same setup and less virtuous intentions. And I mean, in the comics at one point he was the Iron Man equivalent in the Dark Avengers, so it fits. But it might surprise you to know that Norman Osborn was not a founding member of the Sinister Six in the comics. In fact, he started a group called the Sinister 12, which just doesn't have the same sort of catchy ring to its name. The original founder of the Sinister Six is another well-known enemy of Spider-Man, Otto Octavius, but you probably recognize him as Doctor Octopus. Yeah, it's hard to miss those giant metallic tentacles. Although he uses them for evil, they were originally meant to keep him safe from radioactive materials when he was working in the lab. You see, back before he was Doc Ock, Otto was a brilliant guy who had some issues with his loathsome parents. Anyways, Otto ended up in an accident which resulted in some good and some bad. The good was that he could manipulate his tentacles using his mind, which is actually pretty handy. But the bad news is it seriously messed with his mental state, turning him into a villain. So kind of more harm done here than good, I guess. Being a villain soon put him into direct contact with Spider-Man, whose constant thwarting of his evil plans really rubbed Doc Ock the wrong way. So because one supervillain couldn't defeat Spidey, he decided the logical solution was more villains, which to be fair was a pretty good idea in theory. So he set out to contact all of Spider-Man's foes, but only 5 of the villains responded. In addition to Doc Ock, the rest of the villains making up the original Sinister Six were Electro, Kraven the Hunter, Mysterio, Sandman, and Vulture. In 2012's The Avengers, we learned how having a common enemy can unite people who otherwise wouldn't give each other the time of day. Just remember how much Tony Stark and Steve Rogers hated each other when they first met, but they came together in order to fight for what's right, save the world, and all that jazz. The Sinister Six is kind of the same here, except that all of their mutual goals are terrible and related to taking down Spider-Man. Adrian Toomes, also known as the Vulture, is a villain Marvel movie fans are quite familiar with. His company was tasked with cleaning up after the Avengers Battle of New York, only for the contract to be taken away at the last moment. So Adrian naturally turned to a life of crime in order to support his family, which put Peter Parker in a real awkward situation when he realized that he'd been crushing on the Vulture's daughter. In the comics, Adrian Toomes is also a villain who flies around in a metal Vulture suit. But deep down in his heart, he pretty much commits crimes because he just kind of likes doing that. It is important to have a hobby. Another familiar villain in the original Sinister Six is Electro. We haven't seen him in the MCU yet, but he was on the big screen in Sony's The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Maxwell Dillon was a big Spider-Man fan just like the rest of us before he got into a terrible accident involving a bunch of genetically modified electric eels. This accident leaves Max with superpowers, but also a little messed up in the head, and soon has a vendetta against his former hero, Spider-Man. In the comics, Max had the standard miserable villain childhood. Max dreamed of becoming an electrical engineer, but his mother lied about him being rejected from college, and he ended up as a lineman instead. As if his life wasn't unfortunate enough, he then got struck by lightning, which left him with some electricity-based superpowers. He decided that being a villain would be a great way to make some quick cash, and it would have been if it wasn't for that pesky neighborhood Spider-Man. The Sandman, not to be confused with Neil Gaiman's Sandman, is another character we've seen in a Spider-Man movie produced by Sony. He was in Spider-Man 3 back in 2007, and his origin story is actually really similar to the one from the comic books. He starts out as William Baker, a sweet kid who just wants to build sandcastles and play in the sand. Eventually, he transitioned to non-sand-based mediums and found himself the victim of mean-spirited bullies. He ultimately decided if you can't beat them, join them. He quickly goes from beating other people to becoming a petty criminal. Eventually, this landed him in jail, and it just so happened that he was in one occupied by his criminal father. To protect his identity, he started going by the name Flint Marko. When he got out of prison, he got into a situation involving radiation and sand. You know, typical villain origin story stuff. Of course, we won't bother to rehash too much about Quentin Beck since you just finished watching a movie featuring this classic Spider-Man villain. Plus, we already did an entire video about Mysterio, which you can go check out after this one. The final member of the original Sinister Six, Kraven the Hunter, is a character we have been waiting to see on the big screen for what feels like forever, and this isn't just us being greedy. Sony has been teasing us with a live-action Kraven movie for so long. We saw his spear during the end credits of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and he was supposed to show up in the third movie in that series, which never actually ended up happening. Anyways, Sergei Kravenov is a mighty hunter who isn't afraid to take down prey with his bare hands and a little help from a magic potion which gave him enhanced physical abilities. Eventually, he set his sights on the ultimate prey, which is apparently Spider-Man, and not like Galactus or something. In the comic books, this original Sinister Six kidnapped Aunt May and Betty Brant to get the attention of Spider-Man. Of course, Spider-Man not only defeats them, but he makes a series of smart remarks about their cool new club. This is from the guy who once tried to join the Fantastic Four, by the way, so, pot calling the kettle black. Norman Osborn may be an awful person, but he's also brilliant, wealthy, and powerful, and that makes him dangerous. Like Doc Ock, he keeps current with his fellow villains, and isn't afraid to float them some cash in order to further their Spider-Man defeating efforts. Eventually, the Green Goblin got organized and recruited members for the Sinister 12. Some of which we actually saw in Far From Home. There's the Chameleon, who is a master of blending in. He is to makeup and costuming what Quentin Beck is to special effects. It's too bad the two didn't go into show business together. They could have made some awesome movies, but instead the Chameleon chose a life of crime, which eventually put him at odds with Spider-Man. In addition to Electro, Spider-Man has yet another electric enemy, and that's the Shocker. His name is Herman Schultz, and instead of getting his powers from a terrible accident, he just uses a pair of handy weaponized gauntlets. Homecoming fans will also recognize this guy. That's the Scorpion. In the movie, he is an associate of Adrian Toomes, but in the comic books, he worked as a private investigator. He was hired by J. Jonah Jameson to do what else but track down Spider-Man. At one point, he underwent an experiment which left him with some Scorpion-based superpowers, but at the cost of his mental state. While Doc Ock struggled to get 5 villains to join him, Norman Osborn easily collected 11, thanks to his reputation and resources. If Oscorp exists in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it means big things are going to be happening soon, and not the good kind. With this influx of villains, we're going to need more heroes, especially since the current roster is looking a bit sparse after Endgame. While we may have gotten a peek at the new villains, we can't wait to see what new heroes are going to be coming our way to help stop them. What do you think about the possibility of the Sinister Six joining the MCU? Do you think it would overcrowd the place with villains, or are you ready to see them on the big screen finally? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below, and while you're down there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to ScreenRant for even more great content just like this one. Bye bye for now.